December 16, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Private First Class Frank Stelmaszek heard it first. A distant rumble, like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. The 19-year-old from Pennsylvania lifted his head from his frozen foxhole and looked east toward Germany. The entire horizon was glowing orange. Every single tree line lit up like someone had turned on 1,000 suns at once. Then he realized what he was seeing. Thousands of German artillery pieces, all firing at the same time, all pointing at him. 300 miles away in Paris, American generals were celebrating. The war was almost over, they said. Germany was finished. Maybe we'll be home by Christmas. The newspapers back in Washington were already writing victory stories. 1 more month, 2 at most, and Hitler would surrender. But Adolf Hitler wasn't surrendering. He was gambling everything on one last desperate attack. 200,000 fresh German troops, 1,000 tanks, over 2,000 artillery guns, all hidden in the dense forests of the Ardennes, waiting in complete silence. And at 4:30 that frozen December morning, they struck with overwhelming force. The Germans called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. And at the center of this massive German offensive was a small Belgian crossroads town that nobody in America had ever heard of. Within 2 days, 14,000 American paratroopers would find themselves completely surrounded by over 100,000 German soldiers, outnumbered 7-1, freezing to death in the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, running out of ammunition, running out of food, running out of medical supplies, and the Germans were demanding their surrender. This is the story of what happened when ordinary American boys were told to hold that town against impossible odds. This is the story of how a one-word reply became the most famous message in American military history. This is the story of the greatest American battle of World War II, and it started 6 months earlier on a beach in Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The 101st Airborne Division parachuted into France behind enemy lines in the middle of the night. Their mission was chaos. Destroy bridges, cut telephone wires, shoot up supply convoys, confuse the Germans, create havoc. These weren't regular infantry soldiers. These were the Screaming Eagles, volunteers. Every single man had jumped out of an aeroplane at least 5 times before they ever saw combat. They were tough, they were confident, and they were about to earn their reputation as one of the finest fighting units America has ever produced. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard was 29 years old. On D-Day, artillery officer, West Point graduate, tall, lean, sharp-minded, the kind of officer who thought carefully before speaking. On D-Day he jumped into France at 1 in the morning, landed in the wrong field, and immediately got into a firefight with German soldiers who'd been waiting in ambush. He survived, killed his first German soldier that night with a carbine at 15 yards. Over the next 6 months he fought his way through Normandy, liberated French villages, watched his best friends die, and by December 1944 he'd been in continuous combat for half a year without a single day of rest. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was 46 years old, artillery commander for the 101st Airborne. Everyone called him Tony or Old Croc. Short guy, maybe 5'6", broad Irish face, dark eyes, thick eyebrows. He didn't curse, didn't drink much, didn't smoke. The soldiers loved him because he never panicked, never shouted. When things got bad, Tony McAuliffe got quieter. That's how you knew he was thinking. And in December 1944, Tony McAuliffe was about to face the worst week of his entire life. Major General Maxwell Taylor was the actual commander of the 101st Airborne Division. Tall, handsome, brilliant tactical mind. But in mid-December 1944, Maxwell Taylor wasn't in Belgium. He was in Washington, D.C. at a staff conference, explaining to politicians what his division had accomplished in 6 months of combat. So, when the Germans launched their surprise attack on December 16th, Taylor was 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. That meant Tony McAuliffe was in command. And Tony McAuliffe was about to become an American legend. December 17th, 1944, Mermelon, France. 50 miles behind the front lines, the men of the 101st Airborne were resting. Finally, after 6 straight months of combat, they'd been pulled back for what the army called recuperation. The camp at Mermelon was safe, quiet, no artillery, no snipers, no German patrols. The soldiers were playing football in the mud, writing letters home. Some had gotten passes to Paris for a few days. They were exhausted. Their uniforms were worn through at the elbows and knees. Their boots had holes, but they were alive, and the army had promised them several weeks of rest before they went back into action. Private Joseph Willis was 21 years old. Paratrooper, he'd jumped into Normandy on DID with 110 pounds of equipment strapped to his body, fought through France and Holland during Operation Market Garden, and now he was in Mermelon, enjoying the first hot meal he'd had in weeks. Willis was from Tennessee. Quiet kid, good soldier. He'd written a letter to his mother that very morning telling her the war was almost over, and he'd probably be home by spring. Germany was collapsing. Everyone said so. At 8 o'clock that Sunday evening, December 17th, the camp sirens went off. Every man in Mermelon snapped to attention. Sirens meant one thing: combat alert. Get your gear. Load the trucks, move out immediately. Within minutes, the entire camp exploded into organized chaos. Men were running everywhere, grabbing rifles, stuffing ammunition into pockets, looking for their helmets, shouting questions nobody could answer. Where are we going? What's happening? Is this a drill? It wasn't a drill. The Germans had launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes Forest. They'd broken through the American front lines in a dozen places. Thousands of German tanks were pouring west toward the English Channel. American units were retreating in confusion. Some were surrounded, some had been completely destroyed. And right in the path of this German juggernaut was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. A crossroads. 7 roads came together. If the Germans captured Bastogne, they could move their tanks and supply trucks anywhere they wanted. If the Americans held Bastogne, the entire German offensive would grind to a halt. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe, made the decision personally. Send the 101st Airborne to Bastogne. Hold that town. Don't let the Germans take it. No matter what. The problem was simple. Bastogne was 107 miles away. The 101st had no vehicles. Most of their officers were in Paris, and the Germans were already halfway there. This was going to be close. The trucks arrived around midnight, hundreds of them, big, open-topped 2.5 cargo trucks with canvas covers that paratroopers climbed aboard in the freezing darkness. 40 men per truck. No heaters, no lights. The convoy stretched for miles. As they pulled out of Mermelon and headed northeast toward Belgium, it started to snow. Private Willis sat squeezed between 2 other soldiers in the back of a truck. his rifle between his knees, watching the French countryside roll past in the darkness. Nobody was talking. They'd all heard the rumors by now. The Germans were attacking with everything they had. This wasn't some small counterattack. This was Hitler's last big gamble. Win or lose everything. The drive took 8 hours. 107 miles through the darkness, through the snow, through the freezing cold. The trucks couldn't use headlights because German aircraft might spot them, so they drove bumper to bumper in complete blackness, following the truck in front. By watching its tiny blackout taillight, men fell asleep sitting up, others just stared into the darkness, thinking about what was waiting for them. They arrived in Bastogne just after dawn on December 19th. As the trucks rolled into the town, the paratroopers could already hear artillery fire in the distance. The Germans were close, very close. General McAuliffe set up his command post in the Heinz barracks, a Belgian army building in the center of town. He spread his maps on a table and studied the situation. It wasn't good. The Germans had broken through on a front 85 miles wide. They had 4 full panzer divisions heading toward Bastogne, at least 100,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks. The Americans, 14,000 men, the 101st Airborne Division, plus a few tank destroyer units and some stragglers from other units that had been overrun. No heavy tanks, very little artillery, and worst of all, no winter clothing. The men were still wearing their regular combat uniforms, light canvas jackets, no overcoats, no extra blankets, and the temperature was dropping towards 0. McAuliffe looked at his officers. "We're going to hold this town," he said quietly. "I don't care what it takes. We hold." December 19th, late afternoon, the Germans hit the American defensive positions. For the first time, the 101st had spread out in a circle around Bastogne, creating a defensive perimeter about 8 miles across. Each regiment was responsible for one section. The 501st Parachute Infantry on the east, the 506th on the north, the 327th Glider Infantry on the west, and the 502nd, covering the south. In between these units, American engineers and tank destroyer crews filled the gaps. The German attack came from the east, out of the village of Neff. 2 companies of German infantry supported by 7 tanks. They hit the roadblock position held by Team Cherry, an American tank destroyer unit. The fighting was savage and close range. American bazookas knocked out 3 German tanks in the first 10 minutes. German machine guns cut down a dozen American soldiers. For 2 hours they fought back and forth across frozen fields and through destroyed buildings. Finally, as darkness fell, the Germans pulled back. But everyone knew this was just the beginning. The real attacks were coming. December 20th. The weather turned worse. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy clouds rolled in, bringing snow and freezing rain. And the German attacks intensified. Now they were hitting the American positions from all directions at once, north, east, south, west, probing for weak spots, testing the defenses. At Noville, a village 3 miles north of Bastogne, Team Desabray held off an entire German panzer division for 12 hours. American tank destroyers picked off 14 German tanks in a single morning, shooting them like targets in a gallery. But by late afternoon, Team Desabray had lost half its men and was nearly out of ammunition. McAuliffe ordered them to pull back into the main defensive ring around Bastogne. At Warden, a village to the southeast, F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry walked into an ambush. A full German battalion, supported by tanks, hit them from 3 sides. Within 20 minutes, F Company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 87 men killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors retreated to Bastogne on foot through the snow, carrying their wounded, and still the Germans kept coming. More tanks, more infantry, more artillery. They were everywhere. By the evening of December 20th, the situation was critical. McAuliffe called his regimental commanders to his headquarters for a meeting. He spread the map on the table and pointed to the German positions. They now completely surrounded Bastogne. Every road was cut, every escape route blocked. "Gentlemen," McAuliffe said, "we're surrounded." One of his officers, a young captain, looked at the map and then looked at McAuliffe. "So what do we do, sir?" McAuliffe's face didn't change expression. "We hold." December 21st. The Germans tightened the noose. They brought up more artillery and began shelling Bastogne around the clock. Every hour, day and night, the town started to look like the surface of the moon. Buildings collapsed. Fires burned everywhere. Civilians huddled in basements, terrified, and the American casualties mounted. Steadily, the field hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses worked in basement rooms lit by flashlights and candles, operating on wounded men without proper anesthesia because supplies were running low. Men died on stretchers, waiting for treatment. The dead were stacked outside in the snow because there was no time to bury them, and the ground was frozen solid anyway. And the cold, the terrible, murderous cold. Men were getting frostbite faster than they were getting wounded by bullets. Feet turned black inside frozen boots. Fingers went numb and wouldn't move. Some soldiers just stopped shivering and fell asleep in their foxholes and never woke up. Froze to death in the night. Private Willis was in a foxhole on the eastern side of the perimeter. He'd been awake for 48 hours straight. His feet hurt so badly he couldn't feel them anymore. He'd run out of food that morning and his canteen was frozen. Solid German artillery was landing 100 yards away, walking closer with each salvo, and he was down to his last clip of ammunition. 8 rounds, but he wasn't leaving that foxhole. None of them were. Because that's what Americans do. When told to hold, they hold. December 22nd, late morning, the defining moment of the entire battle. 4 German soldiers appeared on the Ardennes road south of Bastogne. They were carrying 2 large white flags. Walking slowly, not shooting. The Americans in the forward foxholes watched them approach, fingers on triggers, confused. What were the Germans doing? The 4 men walked right up to the American lines. 2 officers and 2 enlisted men. The senior officer was Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer was Lieutenant Helmuth Henk, carrying a briefcase. They asked to speak to the American commander, said they had an important message. Private Leo Palmer, a machine gunner, was the first American to meet them. He was from New York, 20 years old, hadn't slept in 3 days. He looked at these 4 Germans with their white flags and their fancy briefcases and thought maybe, just maybe, they were surrendering. "What do you want?" Palmer asked. Lieutenant Henk spoke perfect English. "We have a message for your commander. It is very important." The Germans were blindfolded and taken to F Company's command post. Captain James Adams read the message. It was typed on 2 sheets of paper, one in English, one in German. Adams read it twice to make sure he understood. Then he picked up the field telephone and called battalion headquarters. "Sir," Adams said, "the Germans are asking us to surrender." The message was passed up the chain of command, battalion to regiment, regiment to division. Within 20 minutes it reached McAuliffe at his headquarters in the Heinz barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, McAuliffe's chief of staff, walked into the General's sleeping room. McAuliffe had been up all night coordinating the defense and had finally laid down for a few hours of rest. Moore shook him awake. General Moore said, "The Germans have sent some officers forward. They're demanding we surrender." McAuliffe opened his eyes, looked at Moore, and said one word: "Nuts." Then he rolled over and started to go back to sleep. Moore stood there for a second, not sure if the general was serious. Then McAuliffe sat up and climbed out of his sleeping bag. "Let me see the message," he said. They walked into the operations room where the rest of the staff was waiting. Major Alvin Jones handed McAuliffe the German surrender demand. The general read it out loud to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. "The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the River Earth near Orthuville, have taken Marsh and reached St. Hubert by passing through Hompressibert-Tillet. Lebremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term, or the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity." The German commander, McAuliffe, finished reading. He crumpled the paper into a ball and threw it in the wastebasket. Looked at his officers. "They want us to surrender," he said. "Us, we're kicking their tails all over this town, and they think we're going to surrender." The officers started laughing. Not nervous laughter, real laughter. Because McAuliffe was absolutely right. The Germans had been attacking for 3 days straight and hadn't gained an inch of ground. They'd lost dozens of tanks, hundreds of soldiers, and the Americans were still holding every single defensive position. But the Germans were waiting for an official reply, some kind of formal written response. McAuliffe sat down at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He thought for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "I don't know what to tell them." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kynard, standing nearby, spoke up. "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe looked confused. "What do you mean? You said nuts, sir." McAuliffe thought about it for a second, then he smiled. He wrote 4 words on the piece of paper. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. He handed it to his staff. "Have this typed up and delivered." The message was typed on official letterhead. Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the job of delivering it personally to the German officers who were still waiting, blindfolded, at the forward command post. Harper drove to F Company with the message in his pocket. The 2 German officers were brought out from the woods where they'd been waiting. Their blindfolds were removed. Harper handed them the single sheet of paper. Major Wagner looked at it, read the single word, nuts. He turned to Lieutenant Henk, who spoke English, completely confused. "What does this mean?" Wagner asked in German. "Is this affirmative or negative?" Henk looked at Harper. "I do not understand. What is nuts?" Harper smiled, a big, wide, American smile. "It means go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue this foolish attack, we're going to kill every one of you." The German officers were blindfolded again and escorted back toward their own lines. As they walked away, Harper shouted after them one more time, If you don't understand what nuts means, in plain English, it means, go to hell. The message became legendary within hours. Every American soldier in Bastogne heard about it by that evening. The paratroopers were laughing and repeating it to each other in their frozen foxholes. Nuts. Some of them wrote it on their helmets, others carved it into their rifle stocks. It became a battle cry, a symbol of defiance. The Germans, predictably, were furious. They promised to unleash devastating artillery fire that would level the entire town. They threatened to kill every civilian in Bastogne. Total annihilation. But the artillery barrage never came, because the Germans didn't have the shells. They'd been lying, bluffing, trying to scare the Americans into surrendering without a fight. And it hadn't worked. December 23rd. The weather cleared. For the first time in a week, the sun came out, the clouds parted, and the sky over Bastogne turned bright blue. That morning the men of the 101st looked up and saw something beautiful. American C-47 transport planes. Dozens of them, flying in perfect formation, and as they passed over Bastogne, their cargo doors opened and hundreds of parachutes blossomed in the cold winter air. Supplies, food, ammunition, medical equipment, blankets, everything the paratroopers needed, falling from the sky like Christmas presents. The men were cheering and shouting and running out of their foxholes to grab the supply bundles before they hit the ground. And right behind the transport planes came the fighters. P-47 Thunderbolts, screaming in just above the treetops at 300 miles per hour. There, machine guns blazing, rockets firing, bombs dropping. They hit every German position they could find. Tank columns, artillery batteries, supply trucks, troop concentrations. For 6 hours straight, American fighter planes tore apart the German forces surrounding Bastogne. The Germans had never experienced anything like it. They'd been attacking with near-total air superiority for a week because of the bad weather. Now, suddenly, the Americans owned the sky. German soldiers were diving into ditches, running for cover, watching their tanks explode. Private Willis, still in his foxhole on the eastern perimeter, watched a P-47 destroy a German tank. With a single rocket hit, the tank simply disappeared in a ball of orange fire. Willis started laughing. Couldn't help it. For the first time in 4 days, he actually thought they might survive this. December 24th, Christmas Eve, General McAuliffe wrote a message to his troops. He had it mimeographed and distributed to every soldier in Bastogne. It became one of the most famous documents in American military history. The message read, "What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting, it's cold, we aren't home. All true, but what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades, the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this: we have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west. We have identifications from 4 German Panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key points when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history. Not alone in our division's glorious history, but in world history. The Germans actually did surround us. Their radios blared our doom. Their commander demanded our surrender in the following impudent arrogance. McAuliffe then quoted the entire German surrender demand, followed by his own one-word reply, "Nuts." He continued, "Allied troops are counterattacking in force. We continue to hold By holding Bastogne, we assure the success of the Allied armies. We know that our division commander, General Taylor, will say, "Well done. We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present, and being privileged to take part in this gallant feat of arms are truly making for ourselves a Merry Christmas." That evening, as the sun went down on Christmas Eve, German artillery shelled Bastogne again, and German bombers came over that night, dropping bombs on the town. Buildings burned, more civilians died. But the American paratroopers held their positions, singing Christmas carols in their frozen foxholes, sharing the last of their rations, thinking about home. December 26th, late afternoon, the siege of Bastogne was about to end. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led a column of Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division north toward Bastogne. They'd been fighting their way through German positions for 3 days straight, trying to reach the surrounded paratroopers. Now they were close, very close. The Germans threw everything they had at Abrams's tanks, anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust, rockets, artillery, but Abrams kept moving forward. His Germans fired on the move, machine guns blazing, crushing everything in their path. At the village of Essenois, 3 miles south of Bastogne, the Germans had fortified every building. Abrams called in an artillery strike. American guns pounded the village for 10 minutes, destroying German positions. Then Abrams's tanks charged straight through, firing continuously. Lieutenant Charles Boggis was leading the tank column. As he rolled through Essenois and emerged on the north side, he saw American soldiers ahead. Paratroopers. The 101st. Boggis grabbed his radio microphone. "Come here," he shouted to the paratroopers. "This is the 4th Armored." The paratroopers ran toward the tanks, cheering and shouting. Some were crying. The siege was over. General McAuliffe drove to the breakthrough point to personally thank Creighton Abrams. The 2 men shook hands. McAuliffe looked at Abrams and smiled that quiet smile of his. "Glad to see you," McAuliffe said. The Battle of Bastogne wasn't over. The fighting would continue for several more weeks. The 101st Airborne would stay on the line until mid-January, still holding that town, still fighting off German attacks. By the time they were finally relieved, they'd been in continuous combat for 30 days. No breaks, no rest, just fighting. The casualties were devastating. The 101st Airborne suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing, nearly 20% of the entire division. But they'd held, against 7-1 odds, against overwhelming German firepower, against the cold and the hunger and the exhaustion. They'd held. On January 18, 1945, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech in the House of Commons. He called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and said it would be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The 101st Airborne Division received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be given to an American military unit. The streamer on Americana Division colors reads simply Bastogne and General Anthony McAuliffe. He was promoted to Major General and given command of the 103rd Infantry Division, which he led all the way to Germany and into Austria, where they liberated concentration camps and captured the Brenner Pass. After the war, he became a 3-star general and eventually commanded all U.S. Army forces in Europe. But he's remembered for one thing. One word, spoken in the frozen basement of a Belgian army barracks in December 1944, when the Germans surrounded his division and demanded surrender. Nuts. It's a word that means something very American. It means we don't quit, we don't surrender, we don't give up when things get hard. We stand and fight against impossible odds, against overwhelming force, because that's what Americans do. The young men who held Bastogne weren't professional soldiers. They were boys from small towns and big cities all across America. Farmers and factory workers, students and mechanics. They'd volunteered to jump out of airplanes because their country needed them. And when their country asked them to hold a frozen Belgian town against 100,000 German soldiers, they said yes. They froze in foxholes at 15 degrees below zero. They went without food for days. They ran out of ammunition and fought with captured German weapons. They watched their friends die, and they held, because 14,000 Americans decided that this frozen crossroads town in Belgium mattered, that keeping their word mattered, that the promise they made when they put on that uniform mattered more than their own lives. That's what the Battle of Bastogne means. That's why it matters 78 years later. It's a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's fighting anyway. It's holding your position when every logical reason tells you to retreat. It's looking at impossible odds and saying one simple word, nuts. Private Joseph Willis, from Tennessee, made it home in 1945. He never talked much about Bastogne. Most of them didn't. They just went home, got jobs, raised families, and lived quiet lives. But every December 22nd, for the rest of his life, Willis would remember standing in that frozen foxhole, watching German tanks in the distance, and deciding not to run. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard retired as a lieutenant general. He commanded American forces in Vietnam, and later served as the Army's Vice Chief of Staff. But his proudest moment was suggesting one word to his commanding general in December 1944. And Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe lived until 1975. He died of leukemia at age 77 and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The central square in Bastogne, Belgium, is named Place General McAuliffe in his honor. Every year on December 22nd, the town holds a memorial ceremony. They read his Christmas message out loud, and they remember that one-word reply that saved their town and became a symbol of American determination. Nuts. When the Germans had 100,000 troops and the Americans had 14,000, that single word changed everything. It told the Germans they'd picked a fight with the wrong people. It told the American soldiers they weren't alone. And it told the world that Americans don't surrender. Not then. Not ever. That's the story of Bastogne. That's the story your fathers and grandfathers told you about. And that's the story that every American should remember, because on a frozen December morning in 1944, 14,000 young men proved something important about this country. They proved that we don't quit. They proved that we keep our promises. They proved that when America's back is against the wall, when the odds are impossible, when everyone says you can't win, Americans find a way. They hold the line. They stand their ground. And they say one simple word that changes history. That's the story of Bastogne. That's the story your fathers and grandfathers told you about. And that's the story that every American should remember. Because on a frozen December morning in 1944, 14,000 young men proved something important about this country. They proved that we don't quit. They proved that we keep our promises. They proved that when America's back is against the wall, when the odds are impossible, when everyone says you can't win, Americans find a way. They hold the line. They stand their ground, and they say one simple word that changes history: nuts.